from Salesforce fundamentals and going all the way through app deployment, there's a chunk of that test that we are taking care of. Note that the percentages are based off of Salesforce's ordinary certification guidelines in their study guide. To translate, what I'd like to do is take you from this slide over to where we get our percentages and why we're spending the time that we're spending the time on today in each of the different topics to reemphasize the details. I do so by going to our certification website. So I'm going to go to our certification website, and you can do the exact same thing if you'd like in your browsers. You can book tab and go to the very, very top of your screen, type in trailhead.salesforce.com, and in doing trailhead.salesforce.com, you're going to make sure that you are going in and selecting the credentials side for the drop downs, the tabs. So we'll select the certifications, and with the certifications, you're going to scroll down and open up Salesforce Administrator. Now, I understand that there are a couple of people that might be having issues right now with their GoToMeeting. And if there's an issue with your GoToMeeting, I would recommend going ahead and logging off and logging back into your GoToMeeting. I have not found that there are any slides or issues at this moment in time, and I'm verifying that currently with my partner in crime. So we'll go ahead, and if you are having an issue, as we're doing this review, it would be a perfect time to go ahead and log back out and log back in and see if it'll reset your GoToMeeting and bring your screen up for you. The other thing you could do is consider on the right-hand side of your panel, going in and selecting the button that shows a screen, going to below, selecting chat, and then coming back to your screens. And that might help out in resetting your GoToMeeting. For the rest of us, where we're getting these actual sets of information from is here underneath the Salesforce Administrator, underneath the not Salesforce Administrator, but the Salesforce Developer path. So let me reset and select the Salesforce Developer path. And you'll notice the first developer credential is on the left-hand side underneath certification. The certification for the Platform App Builder, if you click on the link, will come up with a first link on the first screen saying, get your exam guide. This is exactly where we have taken the guidance and the outline for this class. As you refresh it, it'll remind you that you're in the spring release, and it will give you an electronic version of content. Previously, this was all done in what was a PDF. And if you clicked on the link, the PDF would refresh, download for you on the computer, and you'd have this all in a single document. This revised version that you're seeing on the screen right now allows me to jump straight down to the section called Exam Outline number 6. And this will allow us to bring up the percentages for each of the different Salesforce focuses for your certification exam. This is where we are getting the percentages and the time that we're spending online today. So for those of you resetting your screens, thank you for the updates. And for those of us looking at the exam outline, if you open up each of the sections, it's going to let you know what you'd be focusing on as part of not just our review, but what you should know prior to walking into your certification examination. Things like describing capabilities, generally speaking, and Salesforce objects in the schema. So what are the objects and what's the depth we need to know? And when it comes to schema, what is it that we should understand best about the schema? Whether it's relationships and or the fields and or the structures and how they're tied to the different clouds and applications in Salesforce. When it comes to identifying boundaries of declarative customization, do you understand that Salesforce designs based on the premise of Model View Controller, in which we wrap it all up with security and then do it again, reviewing Model View Controller. So what does that mean to you? And when is it time to move from point and click or declarative customization to that programmatic? It's time to start coding. Do you and can you take on common scenarios, talking about the org and extending the uses through the
All
app
good stuff.
exchange? Are you
Oh,
familiar
I'm not
with
worried about
the
that.
different programs and or not just out of the box programs, partner programs and types of programs that are out there? And could you list any of them as relationship to how would you clean and or mass load your
What's
data?
that called?
These are things that are
I got it on
expected of a
Amazon.
platform app developer, is how to push your tool to the nth degree. And then when it's time to decide to go programmatically,
Well, I'm
should I
gonna
go
leave.
ahead and select to download programs or program it myself?
When
So
I
as
leave,
you
I'm gonna leave
continue
at a time
through
to be like, here's
and
the
open
outline
each
of
of these sections,
the
data
data
modeling,
sets. I'm gonna
you
leave
can use this as
during
a
the time when
guideline as we go
reports are
through those
smaller
sections today, saying,
you go
can I
home and then be
answer
home so I can
questions
just
about
send
each
them
of these
to
different areas in depth? And that's exactly what we're about to take on. So as I switch from the certification website and where we got the percentages and how we've broken down this course and return to that of our presentation, you'll see the breakdown, but now you're going to see how we're going to attack it today. In Module 1 and Module 2, we'll start off with your fundamentals, covering your Salesforce kind of overview and your schema. We'll be digging into the depths of security, going all the way through Salesforce security from object security to record security, and then opening up Module 2 now that we've secured and we understand what belongs inside of our Salesforce platform out of the box. So we'll dig into data management, and getting things out of your Salesforce and reporting. Note that we are not going to be sitting for a full 5.5, 6 hours straight. After every 2 modules, after second module, we'll be taking a 10 to 15-minute break, and we'll gauge that based on our day together and the timing in which we've done so. We'll do the exact same thing after Module 4, taking a 10 or 15-minute break, so those of us that need to grab lunch, use a restroom, can do so. Quite frankly, it's best practice not to sit longer than an hour and a half to 2 hours anywhere, anytime. So we'll be taking care of those bodies to stretch up and get ready for the next section of modules. So we expect that every 2 modules or so, every hour and a half to 2 hours, we'll be taking a break, and then we'll be moving on somewhere around 10:30, 11 o'clock this morning to Module 3, dealing with our user interface. With our user interface, we'll be covering things like your page layout versus Lightning page layout components. And we'll be digging into mobile likely. We'll go from that to an in-depth look at business logic and process automation. A large chunk of your certification is on that specific area of how do you best use the logic, and are you aware of all of the programmatic capabilities that are already built into the tool. So technically, they're points and clicks before you ever have to code it. And that's what we'll be discussing today is workflow. We'll be talking about approval processes, flow, and the Lightning App Builder. So we'll take a break after Module 4, and that'll lead us to the last push of the day, which is now that we've talked through and spoken to our model, view, and controller, we'll be going ahead and digging into how should we best deploy our applications. We'll be talking about the declarative capabilities, in particular the change set. And we'll understand better about the change set as opposed to that of the use of managed and unmanaged applications, or in this case, packages we could be designing and building, and what tools to build them with. We'll round things up to the conclusion, and at the end of today, and I don't expect it's going to go the full 6 hours. It did not earlier this week, but knowing that we can concisely end it today in approximately 5.5, 5 hours, we'll make sure that you have that coupon code at the end so you can get that $70 off moving on. So with that, and knowing our course agenda has been set, knowing we do have breaks throughout the day, we will be taking approximately 2 of them during this session. Let's go ahead and let's get started with Module 1, Salesforce Fundamentals and Security. So in this section, again, as a quick high overview, we're going to be describing capabilities that are broad, that are about the overall objects in schema in Salesforce. We're going to set the precedent for how should you consider your Salesforce from a platform app builder perspective. And given scenarios, knowing that you should be approaching it with a model, view, and controller design. So we're going to be able to understand what that means for each side on both the declarative and programmatic side, and then identify scenarios of how are we going to move forward with programmatic customizations. We're going to identify scenarios. We're going to be able to address those scenarios and when we can bring in external products before we end up having to code something in. From there, we'll take on security in this section. And we know security is a lot to bite off. Excuse me, everyone. So go ahead and log off of that and come back to our presentation. And in security, we know that we are going to use our tools in our presentation to describe those features on how to first approach your security with what people can see and do. For those of us not familiar, we're going to make sure that we understand how we apply that to objects in object access with profiles and then permission sets. And we'll extend that through record access and then finally the ultimate of FLS or field access together. And as we continue through, we're going to get through our business set of requirements, making sure we've, since locking down the app, reopen it in the appropriate ways using everything from role hierarchy to sharing roles to team and manual shares to Apex sharing finally. So that is our project, and that is where we start with understanding objects are the building blocks. Objects are the containers in which we hold our data. Know that for platform app builders going into certification, you should know the fundamental or out-of-the-box objects in Salesforce, what we call standard objects. We should know our custom objects, or at least where to go look for them. We know the difference between standard anything and custom anything. The major #1 difference is you can't delete anything that's standard. Knowing that's the case in Salesforce, you should be familiar with the account object and how it has a one-to-many relationship with the contact, the opportunity, and the case. In each of these instances, you should know that the account object is special. The account object is special because it holds a special relationship with each of these following 3 objects. And we know that that special design out of Salesforce can be modified. That relationship set is a lookup relationship, which we'll delve into depth later and what that means. And we're going to understand those aren't the only objects out there. We know that each of those objects, contact, opportunity, and case, also have a list of objects related to them. You as a platform app builder should be able to go down at least 3 layers or 3 levels of objects and describe what is associated to the account, the contact, the opportunity, and the case. When it comes to leads and campaigns on the standard object side, you should know that there is a unique relationship between them, and there's many leads leading to many campaigns is actually a converted lead and or in this case a special object set of data that does so. When it comes to the custom objects on the right hand side, know that all objects, standard or custom, will always be tied to the user object. That user object identifies who are the owners of the records. In this example, if you're looking at a specific scenario and looking at the scenario on the right, those relationships and how those relationships are designed matter. We notice that the user in this example has a position or many positions that could be put in as the user is associated to. We know that those positions have many job applications, but those job applications also have candidates associated, thus making the job application the middle ground or in a what we call many-to-many situation. If it were master detail driven, then it would be a many-to-many junction object. So in knowing these, where do you go look for them? Where do you deeper understand them? Well, you deeper understand and you work with your objects in the most fundamental way. You work with them on a declarative basis to start with. When we see this page come up and we're describing where you see user interface, business logic, and data model, you should know that the data model is the first thing that should be considered. And this morning, this afternoon, for those of you that are online, we'll be actually going through that data model and the components of a data model first. This very, very easy to remember kind of methodology is one that Salesforce did not invent. It's been around forever, and we call it the model view controller paradigm. On the left-hand side, you'll notice in the center of the page, declarative versus the right-hand side being programmatic. Note that this is how we also think of our Salesforce. You always do the clicks before you do the code. So as we describe and go through this class as program app builders and app builders, we go forward. The data model is going to consist of three major areas that we should be concerned about and we should think about before we go further into either the user interface or the bridging business logic. Those areas include objects, fields, and relationships on the declarative side. Now, once those are built, we definitely want to interact with them declaratively. And on that left-hand declarative side, we might consider with the user interface from a big picture all the way narrowed down to a narrower picture, topics like what apps, what tabs, what page layouts, what lightning apps, maybe even what buttons are in screens that we have to discuss and that we can drag and drop in and out of our user interfaces. When we talk about those declaratively, we know that those, the UIs, bridge to the data model through the business logic. And some of that is just a fundamental point and click usage. Things like validation rules and standard validation rules that exist for Salesforce. Some are more advanced validations that we create or custom validation rules. And we extend that business logic above and beyond save buttons and or the edit buttons to automations that we can point, click, and build, ranging from quick actions to workflow to approval processes, flow and process builder. And this is exactly how we're also approaching today's modules and sections in the order you're seeing. Setting up your baseline first, the data model, going to your user interface second and discussing the details of each. Finally, with your business logic, wrapping them all together. And that's how we push this tool with clicks. It should be how we push the tool programmatically as well. So on the programmatic side, note that if you go above and beyond where App Builder clicks take you, then it's time for coding to be done. And on the right-hand side, programmatically, the data model says, well, you can build these objects, fields, and relationships through external code and tools and APIs. You can, when it comes to the user interface on the programmatic side, code in Visualforce pages and or Lightning components. Question is, when do you do which and why would you do them? And finally, you would tie together your business logic with Apex and or Apex code for that programmatic side. So having said this and having described each of these areas, do you and are you aware that sometimes we don't need to even use what's out of the box in Salesforce, or we need to go further? And if you do choose to go further, in what areas can you find applications that already exist that can help solve these problems? As an app builder, in solving business problems, sometimes it's not the point and click, and sometimes it's something that's already built out there. Note that for every one of these categories that perform a function or a specific business niche type of thing, you could actually find these in the Salesforce paradigm as either other tools within Salesforce that you could use and or tools that you could plug in and work with Salesforce. So with that in mind, could you as an app builder describe a data loading tool? My expectation is everyone online could do so. Easy data loading tools, one that's pre-built inside the Salesforce platform and it's already on, and we'll talk about in a lot more detail later today, would be that of the import wizard. But if it's needed to be a little bit stronger of a tool, maybe it's not the import wizard, maybe it's the data loader that you use. and if it needs to be even stronger or more unique for your purposes, where it does have to do deduplication and matching and a number of other things, you might actually consider going to partners of Salesforce that you can find through the App Exchange. So in going through this, know that Salesforce and or our partners will fulfill each one of these different types of areas. So an example of each might be something that you might be aware of before you walk into your certification. Data loading, for example. Informatica might be a company you found on the App Exchange that offer a couple of different tools that you could work with. And not only does that work as far as data loading, but could do data cleansing for you as well. When it comes to electronic signatures, one that each one of us should have pop up in our mind is that of DocuSign. When it comes to e-commerce, in e-commerce, we should all know that Demandware, which is formerly on the App Exchange, and yes, it was acquired by Salesforce recently, is something that you might consider. If you need to go further in email marketing, we know that Pardot and our Marketing Cloud, formerly ExactTarget, are on the App Exchange and available. And each of these companies, both Salesforce companies, will get you deeper into email marketing on either the B2B or B2C side. CPQ, be SkillBrick as an example. How you can take your configure, price, and quote tool even further. For systems integration, maybe it would be something along the lines of Informatica or another middleware that you are using currently. For ERP, that would be an example of maybe using Financial Force. And finally, for data transformation, where you want to really take your data to a different level, Demand Tools might actually do that work and help out with what you need done. Know that there are a number of companies and there are a number of solutions for you, and you as a platform app builder should be familiar with, if I need to go there quickly and I need more robust tools that are built with the Salesforce platform or integrated to the Salesforce platform, what are those tools I should be able to get to and move to quickly? This also explains how we consider our builds moving forward. So when we consider our builds, we should always consider the configure, buy, and build paradigm. So as we design, we think about which way we go. We know that configure, buy, and build bring a little something different each way. With configure, it's just the point and click and get it done. Whether that's pointing and clicking with what exists, or whether that's building it from scratch in Salesforce, you can point and click and build your objects, your fields, your applications. Now, the idea of buying it and getting to a build is whether or not we're going to purchase and bring in a installed package, whether it's managed or unmanaged, or whether or not we need to go further than even packages can go, and it's time for us to code it. So where do we get these things? We should know that the configure is in the back of Salesforce's platform, and by clicking on the gear in Lightning and or the link in Classic, you get to your setup menu and do your thing there. Where you buy is on the App Exchange, and where you build, again, is in the back of Salesforce's platform. We all know that if it's being built in code, it's going to be built in code, either in a sandbox, so we can test our code prior to bringing it forward, and or going to be building it in a third-party tool, something like Eclipse. And you could build in the tool, and with its testing, bring that in code. So why are you doing each? Because you have different resources, and you have different demands for what your applications need. In the configure side, it's very easy for admins, for app builders to take in those business needs. The beauty of it is because it's built on Salesforce and integrated using Salesforce. The upgrades are considered, and as new releases come out, you know it's not going to break. When it comes to buying, if you're working with a company that you're buying the package from, it's something that you negotiate and you work with that company and hope that they are and plan that they are upgrading and keeping up with the latest and greatest. So you have to make sure you're checking on your support and your maintenance. Usually these are pre-built situations in our packages that you're able to customize to some degree that meets your needs. And finally, the programmatic, where you can pretty much design anything you want to, knowing that Salesforce may not have something built out of the box for you, or maybe knowing you need to do it in a unique way, and Salesforce doesn't have a point-and-click way of getting that done. So it's time to go code. It's time to go take care of it, knowing that giving you that control and flexibility also means that you're going to have to maintain it moving forward and making sure it works for each release that comes out. So as we configure, buy, and build, when we do so, we know it all starts with the outside. Where and how do our people get to these different applications, these objects and these fields of ours? And that takes us to the bigger picture in setting up access to all of these different things. So when we talk about the big picture, we like to call this the Superman view of Salesforce. We know that we should always consider how our end users and how we are going to be interacting with the platform. And we know it's from the outside in. We know if we can't get through the outside, things like the trusted IP range, login ranges, login hours, and things that are set up on an organization-wide default setting. Things like your fiscal years and or your currencies and multi-currencies, if those are being done. Knowing the big picture's got to be set up is where it all starts. Now, from that big picture, and knowing that we address those things, just like we would walk into a building from the outside to the foyer, we're not getting to the elevators unless, of course, we've gotten the right badge or the right pass or the right building for that matter in the first place. If we have those squared away, and these are all considerations app builders need to be aware of, not things that are just left for admins, but things that you might find on your certification. If you're aware of those different exterior capabilities in security, then we get deeper into what we call the object level. The object level, analogously in the Superman world, is that of going through the foyer into the elevator. And as you get to that elevator, you know and I know some of the elevators don't have buttons in them anymore. So does that badge get you to the right place? This is analogous to that of, yes, the profiles. So when you are into the Salesforce system and you've logged in, what is it you see? What is it you can do with the objects and the records that you are typing in? It's your license and it's your CRED settings or create, read, edit, delete permissions for a profile in every single object that allow you to go in and interact with the data, the interfaces of your Salesforce. We know that profiles go to not just what you can see in the screen, like the applications, the tabs, the page layouts, the record types. It goes through each of those and describes exactly what a person can see, but even more so, what are you allowed to do? And in that CRED setting, and we know other systems call them CRUD settings, but in ours, create, read, edit, delete records also can be modify all or view all depending on your permissions per object. We know that if we're doing and building our profiles, they should be at a lowest common denominator. So what does this group of people need when they log in with their license and with their profile? And we should strip it down to the minimum amount. So when thinking of that, we know that there's an alternate that kind of allows more people individual access in different ways. And that's when we move from what I like to call the profile of what you generally speak and can see and do to what you can specifically get to. And that is in the specific details, the record settings. Before getting there though, not with what you can see and do with your stuff, we can extend that. And certain individuals might have special capabilities that no one else in the system and or group should. And that's what a permission set does for us. It adds specific details. It adds specific capabilities that a person individually can see and do in the system that no one else in their profile can necessarily do. We'll go into more depth in both profiles and permissions, but as it stands, if we've established what you can see and do with your stuff through object settings and what you have typed in with your things, your records, then it's time to jump out and establish what you can see and do with other people's records. That's where we get to our record depth. Analogously, coming back to getting to the right floor and being able to get off on the right floor from the elevator and go right or left to the appropriate office. So when you get to the right floor, the correct floor, so when you get there, organization-wide default is what sets the baseline access for everyone the same way. We should know that the baseline access default for everybody on the record level of settings for Salesforce is set as wide open or public read-write transfer. So those are the two most broadly used and known. So it is wide open, so everybody can do anything they can with records, and we know that shouldn't necessarily be the case. So we will lock down appropriately our organization-wide defaults and sharing settings, and we'll then set the rules of our business. Those rules of our business, as I like to call them, are the role hierarchy if we decide to choose and use it. A role hierarchy is record access. It's not what you can see and do with your stuff, it's other people's things. So I'm not going to go to too much depth because we will see a couple of slides in the near future digging into each of these topics deeper. But from role hierarchy, vertical access, we open up in record access to horizontal access, and then one-off access with teams and manual shares. And as long as you're following this progression, you can get to the deepest analogous space in the building, the one specific office that you're looking for. And for us in the Salesforce world, that is called FLS, or field level security. The deepest you can go in FLS is field level security. So setting this big picture, let's break down each one of these little areas with a quick graphic and a comment. So as you and I go forward, if we know that we can extend profile access with permission sets, we have to establish what a profile does in the first place. In the screen, an example that you're looking at right now, if you're a sales user and you log in with the license and a profile called sales user, a business may set you up with create, read, edit, and delete access for the following objects in the following way. But if you happen to be one of those sales users that's special, whose job is to go in and clean up your data, to go back and edit and or modify and do something nobody else in the group does, like answer problems to questions and cases, if you need something special that nobody else in that group needs, then this is where the permission sets come in. Note that permission sets are only given to individual users, not groups of people. If the group needs it, the whole profile would get it. This is for individual users. And what I think of them, and I like to think of permission sets as, because in Trailhead, we do a lot of journeys and we take a lot of paths of different things that we like to study. I think, and I like to think of it as a backpack. If I can think of it as the one extra little part of the backpack that I can attach and take with me, it adds something that I did not have before. It never takes away from me, otherwise it wouldn't be given to me in the first place. So know that a permission set always adds and is always additive to what an individual can see and do. So if that is going to further define what I can see and do with my things, when I go into my system and I can do now delete things and I can edit things that I could not delete or edit before, how is it that we describe access on a more broad level, or in this case, record access and the levels of record access itself? Well, we should know as platform app builders, the minimal amount of access that we can get to any record is for someone and or for us to be able to just flat out log in and look at it and see it in the first place. We know this is the most limited view of looking at records. And we should know as we go forward what that baseline sets. It sets the ability for us to potentially get more access. I mean, if there was no access at all, that's one thing, but minimally read access says at least I can see it. Well, the next level of access defined in Salesforce, especially with records that are not yours, or if you're not the administrator, are for you to be able to read and write to a record. This, though, leaves out 4 special capabilities that you cannot do with a record unless, of course, you are the full access owner. Know that full access allows you 4 capabilities with a record that no one but you can ever do. As the person who is the owner of a record, or the person that typed it in for the very first time, know that you as the owner are the only person other than the admin, and admins can do it all the time, but the owner is the only person that can change the owner field, transfer ownership to someone else. The owner is the only person that can change the record type for it. The owner is the only person to delete the record, and the owner is the only person that can use the one-off or manual share button on a record. Now, this ownership is defined, and we should know, by the person that owns the record, or his name is in the owner, or has typed it in for the very first time. Note that that owner, person whose name is an owner of a record, any given record, can also, with their full ownership, if role hierarchy is in play, have their records roll up to their boss through what's called inheritance. So if you are the boss of a person that owns a record, and we as platform app builders have given this person access, so by a role hierarchy, by putting a role hierarchy into our system, not only does the owner and the admin have full access to a record, now the owner's boss, or a person above them in the role hierarchy, and the person's boss's boss, the person above them in a role hierarchy, inherit that access as well. So basically, if you're the CEO, you're a person that sits at the top of this, you would also be able to technically see and do everything, anything below you could do. We'll have a diagram of this momentarily. Now, knowing, generally speaking, levels of record access in Salesforce fall in one of these 3 categories, the biggest and the broadest, I would ask you as a certification type of question, given a certain scenario, what level of access would you give and or would you receive for these records? Read only, read write, or full access. And you would have to go through the logic of how is it that I get full access? So what are the 3 different groups of people that get full access to any given record? And then as you and I go through the next conversations, how would I potentially get read write or read only access? And you need to remember all of the different ways of opening up record access that we're about to discuss moving forward. With that stated, one of the fundamentals of getting record access is through what's called the organization-wide defaults. After you and I, as platform app builders or an administrator, has gone in and set a base for all of the profiles and all of the permission sets, which explain exactly why a person can see and do what they can with their records. And in some rare instances, what they can see and do with other people's records because of modify all and view all given opportunities in object settings on a profile. We know that this baseline is set to completely wide open for everybody when you first receive your Salesforce. This baseline level of access is on an object by object basis. So for every object in our database, we will have a public read-write wide open setting ready to go. Now there are a couple of different settings that are comparable to completely wide open or public read-write. Those would include public read-write transfer for the lead and the case object, or public full access, for instance, for the campaign objects. So when dealing with these special objects, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail, know that the wide open setting allows for everyone to come in and see and edit those records. You need to remember that organization-wide defaults is not about ownership. It's about what you can see and do with other people's records. So we know that there are 4 characteristics that an owner gets that no one else gets with their records. But this means I could go to your accounts if you owned an account, and I could modify everything on that account record if it's left at public read-write. You and I could choose to move forward. And in moving forward, we know that most businesses don't allow everybody to go in and see and do anything they want with anyone's records. So we would want to figure out an easier way to determine what records we should make more conservatively set at either a public read-only or a private level. There are 2 simple questions that will allow us to do so. Those 2 simple questions are, is there one person who is using my Salesforce that should not see this one object's record called ABC Labs, or X, fill in the blank, whatever object setting it was, and one specific record? If one specific record is not allowed to be seen by one person, you must change your wide open setting to a completely private setting in lockdown. That private setting in lockdown says if you did not type it in, you do not get to see it. Now, if it's okay that everyone gets to see all of these records, the second question is simply put, is there one person in this company that should not edit that record called ABC Labs? If the answer to that is yes, then you would choose a lesser, or we call more of a hybrid design, and using public read only to allow everyone to see the record, but not necessarily touch the record that you're in. Now, there are quite a few caveats that you need to know about this. While we know we go through every single object, and as we're going through every single object, we know we're going to choose a different setting based on one of those 2 questions. We also know that if it's an object that is in a master detail relationship, it controls all of the detail object records that are there. So if it is in a master detail relationship, whatever setting is set for the organization-wide default will control all of the detail records underneath. Another thing to consider is when setting our organization-wide defaults. It has only occurred a couple of years ago when we were given the access to do so. But if you have different licensing and different types of profiles, for instance, like you have profiles that include and licenses that include authenticated website users, community users, portal users, and portals we now call as communities, customer and or partner communities. You don't have just one set of organization-wide defaults you need to choose from. You now have the ability to split the difference, and you can actually have an internal versus an external set of access for organization-wide defaults decided. So there are 2 columns when setting up your sharing settings in the OWDs that you may choose from if you activate this external setting group, and know that we, the interior or the company members, could have one set of organization-wide defaults, when all of the other users, like guest users or high volume portal users, will have another set of defaults set for them. This gives you a lot more of an improvement in recalculation and performance. It allows you to much more easily share and reconfigure your organization as you end up moving forward, and allows you to have a lot more flexibility on what's being shared to portals and other external users. So knowing organization-wide defaults, set the baseline of access of not what records you can see about your own stuff, but what you can see about others. Know that usually that means people who are under you, and that's true. Others would be people that would, as a baseline, be your employees. And that means we might consider turning on what we call role hierarchies and applying and using role hierarchies in our organization. As you know, hierarchies and granting access to records or inheritance to hierarchies is done with a simple check on your organization-wide defaults. But building the hierarchy and applying it is done in a different location. It's because it's how we set up the rules in our Salesforce. And when you set up the rules for your business, does a boss and should a boss be able to see and do whatever their employees under them are seeing and doing? The answer Salesforce resoundingly comes back with is for all standard objects, yes. And we don't get a chance to modify that concept if we decide to place in your role hierarchy. For all standard objects, this becomes a default if a role hierarchy is used. So in this case, for US and EMEA sales reps, if they type deals in and or they have issues and can do cases, and they have those already typed into the system because this is part of their job to add those records, if we put a role hierarchy in, the US sales director doesn't see just their own deals and or issues, cases, but they also see an aggregate of all of the cases underneath them. This is not just a reporting feature, because organization-wide defaults in standard objects, and you can choose yes or no for custom objects, have a simple checkmark box that grant access through hierarchy in this way, through the simple checkmark box there, and the inclusion here of putting a role above another. You are saying essentially the US sales director can inherit, which means do whatever the sales reps can do with their own records. This is where we get the boss can see and do what you can see and do with your stuff. So you aggregate not just reporting up, but the capabilities of full ownership get modified here. The capabilities of full ownership would get them modified because a boss can now do the same thing that a person that owns a record can do with their own records. This is where it would go from the boss, the US sales director, up to the VP of Global Sales, and the VP of Global Sales all the way up to the CEO. So knowing inheritance is a key word or a key phrase, it would apply vertically, but it does not apply across the organization. So the first thing we do is set our baseline, and that baseline affects all users in your system, from CEO all the way down to the new sales rep in Europe. And once that's been done, we choose to put in a role hierarchy. Before I leave role hierarchies, oftentimes companies might ask and individuals might ask, why would I put a role hierarchy if I don't need it? And one of those things is you might be considering the oversight. Not just the oversight of you don't need to silo your data, that's fine. So one group is separate than the other and it's not overwhelming quantity of data, then that's fine. But you might be looking at, you can use role hierarchies in many other places in the system as well. Things like your content and content management, or libraries and library management, or in the next area of sharing rules and how you both share both with the business sharing rules and or the manual or one-off shares down the road. With no role hierarchy and people not in roles, you can't use these different features to break out your information in appropriate ways. This extends to content management. It extends to folders and the sharing of folders, whether it's documentation folders, whether it's email template folders, whether it is folders for reports and or dashboards. All of these areas would be affected by having built a role hierarchy in the first place. So know that it is a lot more flexible in viewing and or working with records in more than one way throughout your entire system. Knowing that we set up a baseline and then we set up the rules to play by, then it's a matter of, from this point forward, systematically kind of realizing that we still don't have people seeing what they need to see. And that means we've got to create exceptions to these role hierarchies. And those exceptions first come here in what we call sharing records and in sharing rules. Sharing rules are designed by us, the administrators and app builders in the system. They're designed by and considered part of the ongoing use of how people should work in our organization, and they're built into the back of the system by us. These sharing rules are exceptions to the org-wide defaults and or the role hierarchies because they go horizontally across the organization. When we build out sharing rules, know that sharing rules are unique because they're one way, one direction shares. The nice thing about it is, much like the organization-wide default has two simple questions to help understand and help break out how you should set up your OWDs, sharing rules have two simple questions that do the same. The two simple questions, sharing rules, will allow you to literally share any object set of data that's available to you, is by asking the simple question of who owns it and whom do you want to share with. These two questions break down into 4 data points. Who owns it and whom do you want to share with? The first 2 data points come in the first question. And we always start in sharing rules by selecting what is it that we want to share. It is an object set of data. Remember, under the sharing section, you can look at every single object and choose to share all of it or a simple criteria subset of it. This is the second part of it that you need to consider. There are actual radio button selections, and it'll say all. In this case, it's not directly all, it's records owned by or records owned by the owner, or criteria subset of it. So in an example, for US sales, if I had a sales team in the United States that needed to have records shared with a team that's in Europe, and because they're two vertically separated areas, they ordinarily would not have their data shared. So we're going to create the exception or the sharing rule that says, yeah, but I don't want Europe typing in the exact same accounts because of duplicates and there are problems all over the place. So what we're going to do is allow read access from one to the next. Who owns it? It would be my opportunities. That would include the name of the deal and the account name. Is it just all of it, or is it just some of it? So in the example, we would say all of it. If it were a criteria subset, it would be because it's just the stuff that is in Montana that needs to be shared, or just the stuff with product A or product B that would need to be shared. In this example, who owns it? It being opportunity object, all of the opportunity, so owned by record owners. And then I can say who is the group that owns it. In this case, it would be the role of the US sales rep, assuming that we've established roles for that group. Now we could share with, and that's the other side of it. Whom do I wish to share with? The role of EMEA sales rep. And when we decide that, the second data point for the second question is, what level of access will you share? The two choices are read or read write. So in my example, I'm offering you on this screen of a one-way share. U.S. sales reps need to share their opportunities to the European sales reps, read access. You and I just simply answer the two questions with that statement. Who owns it? Who do you want to share with? Well, we need to establish a little deeper the who part. If we answer who owns it, know that who can be a role. Who can be a role and all of their subordinates. Who can be a public group. A public group is an entity that allows us to simplify sharing. A public group is designed by us, the app builders and administrators, and a public group is comprised of roles and their subordinates, users, and other public groups. So the third option in who owns it is public group. The last option is that of a queue. Q-U-E-U-E. A queue can act as an owner in Salesforce. A public group cannot. A queue can act as an owner. Queues are established and can be built by us for two standard objects, leads and cases, and any custom object. Leads, cases, any custom object. So in establishing these sharing rules, in answering the first question, we've now established the four possibilities of who can own it. The first one, roles. Second one, roles and subordinates. Third one, public groups. Fourth one, queues. In the second question, whom may we share with? You may only use three of those four options. Who you share to can only be roles and subordinates, and public groups. You may never share to a queue. If a queue needs it, a queue has to own it. So in establishing those two questions one more time, who owns it? Whom do you wish to share with? We've established what is it, all of it or some of it, criteria based. We've established the object already by what it is. We've established who, role and subordinate, public group or queue. And the second question, whom do you wish to share with? Could be a role and subordinate, and or a public group. It cannot be a queue. And what level of sharing are you going to give them? Read or read write. And if you know these two questions and 4 data points, you've gone as far as you can go with sharing records. Remember that when you share, you are sharing object sets of data. And remember, if you have objects that have master detail relationships, what you do to the master is by default what happens to the detail objects of it. What you do to the master is going to happen to the details as well. Therefore, in looking at sharing rules, you will never see physically in edit mode detail objects. It will not show you in edit mode. In regular view mode, it'll show you that they are controlled by their parent. And these are things in sharing rules that you would pay attention to. Last thing about sharing rules is if you do choose to share, you can't share unlimited number of rules with an object. You have a limit of 200 rules per object that you may share, of which only 50 of them per object may be criteria based. So in larger organizations, you have to be very, very sparing with how you share as a business And this is where the concept of public groups becomes very powerful. The use of public groups and simplifying your sharing rules becomes very powerful. So we've established a lot of details in sharing records with others across the system. It's time for us to go ahead and talk about how we can share records manually. Manually comes in a couple of different flavors. And the first way you can manually share is a very obvious way. It also brings up kind of a leftover from doing your sharing rules. When you do your sharing rules, and if someone leaves the company and or someone gets deactivated and someone else, a brand new person, takes over their records, we know that the sharing rules built by your business that we just talked about with those two questions automatically recalculate. But manual sharing gives you even more flexibility and does not. What's interesting, although it gives you a ton of flexibility to pick any one individual, a user, and or a public group, and or a role and a role in subordinate, you can, in Classic, use a button on the screen, and that button to share your record with any of those others gives you the most amount of flexibility there possibly is. The problem is when you leave the company or you go ahead, and that means get deactivated, or you get a promotion and you head to another job and all of your current records are handed off to the new person. What happens to these manual shares, because they're personal, they're yours, is they all get broken and disappear. Know that manual shares and the button, share button in Classic shows up on the screen when organization-wide defaults are modified. Yeah, I said that right. When the OWDs go from wide open to anything more conservative, in Classic and in Classic only, a share button will show up on the screen of the object set of data. The share button shows up on that screen with either a read or a read write, depending on what the organization-wide default is. It makes sense, because if everything's wide open public read write and you make it completely locked down as private, then both options should be available for the owner of the record to say, I want X person to go ahead and now have access at a read or read and write level. If the access to the object is already as a default set up as read only rather than public read write, it makes perfect sense that when pressing the share button on the screen that shows up only gives read write, because everybody's already got read access to it already. So knowing a manual share button does get put on for Classic, know that you can download a component from the App Exchange, and that component is a share button for Lightning. Lightning does not get the manual share button automatically put on the screen. You can download it from the App Exchange, and you can download the component as long as you've already set yourself up with a domain for your Lightning, and that's required by having custom components downloaded. It is not something that comes standard or out of the box in Lightning. Now, one of the issues with manual is because it's a personal choice, the business does not hold on to it or carry it over when records are transferred or the owner disappears. The owner is deactivated, essentially. So knowing that those shares are automatically deleted, Salesforce created a capability which I like to call a manual type of share that bridges the world of business sharing and sharing rules to that of manual shares. The bridge between the two is also a form of manual share because the end users can be given the opportunity to add individuals to what we call teams. Teams are never turned on by Salesforce by default. We have to choose to turn teams on, and teams only work for 3 objects. Teams work for opportunities, teams work for cases, and teams work for accounts. Know that the 3 account teams, opportunity teams, and case teams each bring something unique to the sharing. And one of those unique things all 3 bring is the bridge that manual sharing does not give. We know that manual share automatically disappears when a user is deactivated or user is transferred to a record transferred to a new user. That is not true with teams. When a user is deactivated, teams, no matter what team it is automatically prompted to the app builder or administrator, asking them, do you or don't you want to keep this individual in this team? It will prompt upon deactivation to pull you out of all teams that you may be related to. So there is a prompting that is interactive with the admin and or person doing the deactivation. It's not just an automatic poof, it disappears. The other thing to consider is when it's mass transferred. When it's mass transferred, depending on how it's transferred, a prompting will come up asking the person who's doing the transfer work, the admin or the app builder, do you want to keep the team or do you want to mass transfer the existing team to the new person's team? These teams can be designed by us and or by the end user if we allow it, and turn on the feature for them to get to their related list called team shares. So teams are the bridge between the manual one-off share and the actual sharing rules the business dictates. So knowing you've got 3 teams, know that the account team is special, and the account team and manual teams also allows for not just one account to be given either read or read-write access to, but all records underneath and associated to that account. So an account team share allows an individual to not just give one record access, but it could be many records, because it could be all the not accounts, but all the contacts, all the opportunities, and all the cases. Yes, 3 other objects of access and many other records underneath the one account can be given as accessible records to the person who is being added to the account team. The account, excuse me, the account team is special because it gives object access, record access to 4 different objects at one time. Record access to 4 different objects related to a single account at one time. The account and all related contacts, opportunities, and cases.
Oh,
that is the only object that does multiple objects. The case team is unique because there can be 3 different case teams built per case. And for those of us that have ever worked in the support departments, we would understand or have seen something like this, because sometimes you have an issue or a case that comes in that has a product support team 1, and then it has a product support team 2, and or it has help desk level 1, tier 1 help desk, tier 2 help desk, and then a specialty help desk possibly associated to it. So manual shares aren't just the simple one-off and it's done. They could be manual shares one-off, it's done in a share button, or could be considered as team shares. The final share that you should be aware of that is declarative and is associated to manual is called an Apex sharing reason. Apex sharing reasons are literally labels that we can create as platform app builders and or as admins And if we label it, it's only custom objects that we can apply these to. Custom objects only allow us to use Apex sharing reasons, and those Apex sharing reasons allow a manual share to not get deleted because we as a business have decided to put a label on why it should stick around. So essentially, instead of manual shares automatically disappearing, if it is an Apex sharing reason, instead of a single manual share, and it's been defined with the extra label, it will not break the sharing of a single record with another person because we as a business deemed it necessary to have it kept around. It's a label we create and Salesforce writes the code for us. And again, it's only good for custom objects and custom record shares. So we have covered a lot of information and key data takeaways as we go through this entire progression. Organization-wide defaults set the baseline. And with organization-wide defaults setting the baseline, we know the wide open baseline for every single object is public read-write or public read-write transfer. We know that there are some alternates like controlled by parent and or public full access we should be aware of and brush ourselves up on when it comes to getting prepared for our certification. But once the OWDs, organization-wide defaults under sharing area, under our sharing rules, show up, and we're going to, and I shouldn't say sharing rules, I should say sharing, period, in the back of your Salesforce, then you and I know we set the rules of the game up with role access. It's vertical access we define before we do horizontal access. And finally, the one-off access. We remember of these 4 different areas and categories, there were 4 questions you could remember to make it easier. 2 questions for organization-wide defaults, 2 questions for sharing rules. OWD's questions were, is there one person in this company should not see this record? The second question, is there one person in this company should not edit this record? For the sharing rules, who owns it? Whom do I wish to share with? So 4 questions, 4 parts, and 4 ways to manually open up access before you can unlock access with Apex sharing rules, or you need to go to code. Know that these are all declarative ways of giving data access to your end users as you move forward. So, and all of these lead us to better, cleaner, and safer data.